Hi everyone, thank you for joining me in relation to this run through of the new SBL exam pre-seen for the December 23 exam sitting. My name is Paul and I'm hoping that over the course of this three-part series I'm going to inform you as to NCTech, our company, and indeed the cloud services industry from the information shown within this short document. The first thing we're going to do, though, before we get into the body of the pre-scene is just take you through a couple of pointers, if you will, a little bit of advice in relation to your approach to these videos and indeed the exam. Bottom left-hand corner there, you'll see some guidance. Now, I've broken this down and made it very, very simple, but let's be clear about what this document does. It really provides us with context in relation to the company and indeed the environment. What they tell us is that there are no signals as such within this particular document. In other words, there's no hints or tips towards specific exam questions or tasks on the big day. Notwithstanding that, I'm going to, throughout the course of the three videos, just point you in the direction of syllabus areas that pop up within the pre-scene, and also ones that tend to feature fairly regularly within the SBL exam. Note that you will be given a copy of this pre-scene in the exam. You won't be able to bring in your own annotated copy. And indeed, point number 4, danger. There are a series of things that the ACCA advise that you shouldn't be doing. And really, in the main, it's to fixate on the industry that's relevant to NCTech. In other words, this service provider. In effect, what they're saying is that if a significant part of your study is really based around research or trying to become an industry expert, then it's going to be time not well spent. Now, what's my guidance? I can tell you that having taught case study exams for a number of years, there's several key points that I would advise you to take care on. And the first one is really the whole essence of case study exams and indeed UAP. I think the first thing that you need to do in relation to this particular exam, several weeks out from the big day, is make sure that you have an understanding of what the SBL case study exam is. In other words, this is an exam, broadly speaking, that is testing your skills. Case study exams, in the main, are about a modicum of knowledge and good skills. I'll come back to that point. Outside of that, given that we have a pre-scene document that sets the context for this particular company, NCTech, we need to analyze it to understand the company. And that's where this three-part video comes in, and indeed the idea of doing a strategic analysis, the next video that you'll be looking at. Outside of that, I encourage you to practice. There's nothing like practice. And just on that area of practice, for me, the key to success in the SBL exam, and I've taught it for several years, is failure. In other words, fail in your mock exams and learn from the experience. Generally speaking, the 50% of students that don't pass this exam every sitting, generally speaking, they avoid question practice and certainly multiple mock exams. So this UAP concept is, in effect, understand what they're testing, which in the main is a combination of skills, communication, professionalism, timekeeping, etc., etc., etc. Outside of that, analyze the information that we're given within this pre-scene and then practice. For me, number 2 is definitely relevant because one of the reasons that we see case study exams playing a bigger and bigger part of professional exams is that employers are asking for students to be more skilled and skillful. So really, professional bodies such as the ACCA are switching the way that they examine students. In other words, broadly away from knowledge-based, certainly at the high-end subjects, etc., the options papers, strategic, professional, etc. So we should be thinking of this exam as a sort of a role-play exam. And when you answer questions, try to answer them from the perspective of you. In other words, what do you think? Bring in your skills. You've got to show skills. You might even think of it like an interview. You walk into an interview, they're looking to see what skills you have. So think like that and avoid doing things like knowledge dumping. Employers certainly want skills. You're familiar with the workplace if you're working now. Skills are where it's at. Now, outside of the skills that are mentioned in the requirements, as I've just said, there are other skills that are relevant. Certainly, typekeeping is a big one in the SBL exam. In other words, spending allocated time between parts of questions and indeed moving on when you have to. Time can kill you in this exam. Outside of that, obviously, communication, professionalism. You need to show the examiner by using the information you've been given, not just the pre-seen, but obviously the unseen information on the day, that you're a skillful person. So think like that. Note point number 4, broadly speaking across the board within the ACCA and other professional bodies, these case study exams are set to see what you can do, not what you know. As I've just mentioned, knowledge dumps are an absolute no-no. You've got to answer the question that you've been asked and display the requisite level of skills. So there's guidance from 2 parties, as it were. Next area here is, what do we have for you at Astranti in terms of material? Well, as I've just mentioned, we've got a 3-part series. This is video 1. This will be the longest one, around about an hour, probably just over. The second one is the strategic analysis. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, as you'll see when you run through the presentation, in essence, what we're trying to do is to inform you as to the company by using a series of tools and techniques. In fact, we hinge the strategic analysis on the rational model. So you'll see within that strategic analysis video a number of models, including SWOT, Mendeley, Porter's 5 forces, etc. So in essence, what we're trying to do with part 2 there in the strategic analysis is really inform you as to the company, its business model, where it's been, where it is now, and where it could go in the future. In essence, we're sort of trying to turn you into an employee of this business so that when you face questions on the day, in one sense, you'll sort of been answering them from the perspective of someone who knows a lot about the business, who's informed. And if we think about it, if the exam, as you walk in, is about the company that you now work for, in other words, all of the questions pertain to a company that is currently your employer, then the exam would be a lot easier. Why? Because you know so much about your employer. You've been working there, let's say, for a year, 2 years, or whatever. And it's the same with the SBL. Let's become, informed through the use of these pre-seen videos ×3 and indeed the strategic analysis. Outside of the first 2 there, we've got top 10 issues. Now, this is quite useful. What the ACCA tell us is be very, very careful about question spotting, about trying to second guess the examiner. I agree with that up to a point, but what we can do is hone in on a series of issues that really are fairly obvious if you look at the pre-seen. So that particular set of 10 in that video will be useful because it will point us in the direction of areas of the SBL syllabus. Point number 4, the industry analysis of PDF. Now, for me, the industry analysis is about as comprehensive as you can get. And indeed, with 1, 2, 3, and 4, I don't think there's too much research you need to do outside of the Astranti offering. In other words, spending time delving into Google about service providers and AI and business intelligence. Yeah, a little bit, but not too much. The information within part number 4 is absolutely bulletproof, and it's a very, very comprehensive and long analysis. Point number 5 is mock exams based on the new pre-seen. So there's that 3-part. Now, outside of that, just 1 or 2 other points before we delve in. You'll see when we come to the body of the pre-seen that I will be annotating, highlighting, etc. as we go. I have pre-populated the pre-seen in green with what I call core information. Now, there's not a lot of it, but that's information that we need to be familiar with sharpish very, very quickly. Let's not put ourselves in a position where we're in the exam and we're having to search for this information. It needs to be at our fingertips, absolutely. So when you see the green highlights, i.e. pre-populated, that's information that must be under your belt quickly. In terms of the yellow highlights, I'll show and hide and unhide annotations as we go along. The information in yellow is certainly important, but more add-on. Now, I'm not suggesting that we ignore it, but this is the core and this is the add-on. I've done a little thing here, which I do from time to time when I annotate PDFs and provide them with students, to just point you in the directions of things that come to my mind when I do exercises like this. You know, whether or not that's for CIMA or for another body or for the ACCA. I've said caution, red flag. Really what I mean there is I'm going to point you in the direction of some syllabus areas that for me are important. In other words, you know, you need to go to them if you are unfamiliar with them. You'll see as I go, there's only about 4 or 5, but you know, I tend to get a feel for exams. The more you tutor, the more you lecture, the more you get an idea of what the examiner likes and doesn't like. So I've seen or picked up certainly a few, and I would say in my experience of marking SBL scripts, some of these areas, not all, some of these areas, students tend to fall down on them. Yeah, so that's why I red flag them. Okay, so let's move into the sort of body of today. Now, I've said that we've got 3 pre-scene videos. You'll see that pre-scene video 1 is certainly going to be the biggest. That's the one that we're in. I would say just over an hour or thereabouts. And within pre-scene video 1, I'm going to take you through quite a short introduction and indeed various information about the industry, a lot of information. Now, I've annotated each of the 3 videos, but in particular this area, because I really do want you to be informed, and I don't want you to make the mistake of going on to Google and spending hours and hours trying to be an industry expert. So I've done my own research, and also note that we have the industry analysis, but I'm hoping that by the end of this particular video, certainly you're going to have a pretty good feel, even better feel than you have now, on the industry, running from obviously the overview all the way through to KPIs. The second key area is really relating to the company itself. It's a little bit shorter, quite interesting though, and lots of juicy information and a couple of red flags in there too, areas that we need to look to. And then the final video, pre-scene video 3, the shortest of the lot. This will link in nicely where they refer to the strategic position, to our strategic analysis, which is obviously our next video set. Okay, now let's move on into, I guess, what you would call the sort of the starting point, or indeed the body, as it were. Okay, now I know you've had a chance to run through the pre-scene. You may be scratching your head and saying, I don't know too much about cloud service. You know, what could they examine? I think the key point is this. Remember what I said from the off. What we're looking to do is just to get context in relation to the industry, certainly in this video, and indeed in pre-scene video 2, the company itself. So what do we have here? We have this company that's involved in cloud service. So this is a company that really provides a service to a variety of other clients. In effect, I would suggest that you, me, just about everyone we know, just about everyone that we come into contact with has some sort of connection in some way, shape or form with the cloud, whether or not it's YouTube, Gmail, Hotmail, you know, storage of some kind. So the bottom line is that this is an industry, and this is a company certainly, that has grown rapidly over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. Now, they're based in Farland, a developed country. This is important. You'll see how relevant that is when I bring up my annotations on this particular area of the pre-scene. So this country is developed and indeed home, note, to many technological companies. Now, I'm wondering, does that make you think of any particular model within the SBL syllabus? It certainly makes me think of one, and indeed one that he's examined several times. More of that in a moment. Note that the founders are 3 software engineers. Now, as I've mentioned here, this particular company is successful. We do have limited financial information at the very end of this pre-scene, but suffice to say, it's grown rapidly. And that's no surprise given the area that it's in. So its first 10 years of operation, one would ask ourselves, really, how has it grown? And indeed, is there a pattern? Is it organic? Is it by acquisition, etc.? Outside of that, there's reference to the three main founders and indeed the NCTech board. Now, we know that when we have mentioned the board, we know that one of the favorite topics of this particular examiner is certainly corporate governance. So in terms of areas from this first intro, it's a little bit shorter than the intro provided for the September 23 exam, but nonetheless some interesting information. We've got the basics of the company, we've got the basics of the environment that it operates in, and we see it's successful and indeed still private, albeit for the fact that there are some outside investors. More of that later. Now, in terms of the first three paragraphs here, the sort of industry overview, this goes on a little bit, but I'll just take you through the first three paragraphs first. So, what are we talking about here when we talk about cloud service? Let's assume no knowledge. We're really talking about data storage and indeed computing services. As mentioned, something that I'm sure perhaps your company and indeed you use. If we simplify it, we're really talking about the link between the cloud and users or clients. Now we see from the next paragraph that certainly over the course of time, as is always the case with tech, whether or not it's software or hardware, always, over the course of time, things get more affordable. So competitive pricing has really opened up this industry to a range of different users and a range of different clients. It's very unlikely that established businesses wouldn't be in a position to either want to or to use cloud service companies. Now, in terms of the industry itself in this developed country of Finland, it's certainly well established, more than 10 years, and continues to grow. So we've got them operating in an environment as a successful company in a real growth industry, and an industry that's only going to grow even more over time. So let me just flick into the annotations here. Now, as you can see, there's quite a lot of information here. I'm going to go over just one or two other points outside of what I've just said. Now, here I mentioned a model. Now, let's be careful with models. When I mark SBL exam scripts, the problem with the various models, and there's quite a few obviously within the syllabus, is within the exam itself, the models are not generally signposted. In other words, where he has examined Porter's diamond, he won't show that in the requirement or indeed the body of the paragraph above. He'll just hint towards it. So in order to use models, and he never requires you to use a specific one, but he generally tends to hint towards them. This particular model, if we were looking for hints towards the use of Porter's diamond, perhaps in relation to expansion for NCTech into another country, then we'd be looking to pick up from the exhibits within the unseen determinants or elements or factors or reasons for NCTech to go there. In essence, what we're saying here, and I'll deal with the Fockers in a minute, don't worry, don't get alarmed. What we're saying here is, it's very clear from this first paragraph that one of the reasons for the development of this particular industry in Finland has been elements of the diamond. We know that it's a four-pronged area, and we know that there are two areas outside of that, basically government intervention or lack of it, and indeed chance events. But let's stick with the main four. If I was to see a scenario of some kind, I'd be looking to hone in on anything under the banner of those four elements: demand conditions, factor conditions, etc. Now, note that in essence, what Porter says is that the reason why some particular nations, have this sort of advantage is because of these key factors, these determinants. And in this particular case, we need to think about what would be the sorts of determinants, reasons, factors, etc., that would have been evident within Farland that led to the development. Now, just so that you're not worried about this area of the Fokkers, I'm going to leave you to figure that one out. But this is a reference to the German car industry. Now, it's a little bit sort of unusual, I would admit, but I just wanted to put one or two things in this particular video that prompt you to remember these areas. In other words, prompt you to remember, what does Porter's diamond mean? I mean, if we get a question in the SBL exam that hinges on a model, it's so easy to deal with if you know that model. So you've got to start sort of doing a little bit of revision on different areas. Certainly Porter would be up there in my top 10. Outside of that, if we move down the page, I mentioned the whole area of corporate governance. Now, the chances of corporate governance coming up within the SBL exam, I would say, is pretty good, certainly more than 50%. It looks to me, and we'll see this later on in our video series, that they're pretty well covered with 6 exec and 6 non-exec. Now, does that mean that corporate governance wouldn't come up? Not at all. He can put in any scenario. And my experience of dealing with CG within the SBL exam is, unfortunately, because there's so much volume, students aren't really au fait with enough of it. They tend to struggle in CG questions. Do remember that with corporate governance, and it's got to be relevant to a company like this, not least because of the fact that this is a company that is highly successful, it has outside investors, etc. The bottom line is that we need to be able to spot issues or problems within the CG regime. Okay? Now, if we move a little bit down the page here, I've talked about the twofold area. And we can see clearly that if we're offering data storage and computing, then certainly infrastructure is relevant. In other words, internet, etc. In essence, what this business model does is it sort of shifts, doesn't it? It shifts clients, customers away from using their own IT towards using these service providers. If we move down the page, I'll turn off the annotations now that we've dealt with the sort of top bit, as it were. Bear with me 1 second. So, moving from where we were, we basically said that we're comfortable with Farland, very, very good track record in this industry, continues to grow. So what are the numbers? What are the stats? Now, remember what I said about the green areas here. These are, for me, the most important areas. Let's make sure that when we walk into the exam, so to speak, we're familiar with this. This is a massive industry globally, 155 billion. It's absolutely humongous, and it's growing year on year. You'll see there's a slight sort of difference between the two in terms of percentage of data, but that's likely to even up over time, I would have thought. In terms of the percentage, I'll show you that in a moment. It's a very, very small percentage, Farland in comparison to globally. That's not an issue. We're still talking about $8.3 billion. And then outside of that, we'll see the top 10 cloud service share of the market. Very, very significant. And I would suggest, based on the numbers, that certainly NCTech are not one of them. I'm not so sure they're going to be one of them, possibly, but if they are, they're on the outside. Okay, so very, very big numbers here. Outside of that, we're just going to come into a section that sort of provides us with the sort of main models. Now, I put caution red flag here because, for me, we'll see that if I just scroll down just slightly, we'll see that NCTech is firmly squared in here. Now, I'll explain what IS is in a moment, but there are two other options. Now, it stands to reason when we're talking about a company that's growing very, very quickly over the last 10 years, that the chances of them moving towards the more premium services, and we'll see what they are in a moment, are very, very high. Now, how would they do that? More than likely through an acquisition of some kind. And you'll see within case study exams, SBL and others, one of the key questions that we tend to get from time to time are the sort of benefits and risks of an acquisition of some kind, or possibly some sort of JV or alliance, but more often than not, an acquisition. And that begs a number of questions, doesn't it? It begs the question of, firstly, as just mentioned, benefits and risks, or possibly suitability, accountability, and feasibility, and a range of other things, including, for example, financing, although that isn't a big part of the SBL exam. So certainly this is a flag in terms of understanding the key difference between these three service models. Remember, NCTech here, and two others. Let me just turn the annotations on here. In fact, I'll just move down slightly. I'll just show you the next two. So just take a look. So we've got basically sort of, I guess, your basic, although it's not overly basic. I've done my research on this. IAS is certainly not a basic service, but let's call it sort of low level. We move up to platform as a service and then through to SAS. Let me just put on the annotations here. So what we'll see here, excuse me, is that my suggestion, given the fact that NCTech is in this area, a very basic service, network service and data storage, where basically we're leasing capacity, or clients are leasing capacity, and they keep the cost down by having their own expertise. Now, what this lends itself towards, as I've said, is them moving down the page in this direction. Now that makes me think of Ansoff, Igor Ansoff, the eminent theorist, lecturer from Harvard, and this whole area of product or indeed service expansion. Now, as mentioned in relation to models within the SBL exam, he is not, I repeat, not going to signpost them. So we've got to look out for, within the requirements, within the body of the paragraphs above the requirements, anything that pertains to this area, and them moving perhaps from what they've been doing, let's say market penetration, in some other area. Now we know from Ansoff's matrix that basically it's a 4-part grid, with the most basic area being penetration. In other words, increasing your market share. So if you will, the first option for this company, and indeed the board, would be the company simply doing the same as they've been always doing, i.e. penetrating the market further. Now from there, the two other main options are product development and indeed market development. So the question under Ansoff's matrix is, which direction will they go in order to expand further? Where can they go? And would they go as far as to diversify in some way? We'll know that the whole grid, the 4-part grid, really hinges on products and services and markets, new and existing. Certainly let's take a look at that model, because for me, given this dynamic environment, given their success so far, they're growing, this is a competitive market, they want more revenues, they've got to be going down the page. Okay. Now, one thing I did find, I just thought it was some of interest, may not be relevant at all, outside of what they suggested here. One of the other things that is offered by IS type providers is load balancing. Okay, I just thought it was an interesting concept, because load balancing sort of simply means where sort of CSPs sort of have this facility, this piece of software that sort of operates like a traffic cop, where it directs sort of traffic to the right server so that one or other doesn't get overloaded. I think it's always nice to get familiar with some terms outside of what we see within the pre-scene. So load balancing, if you imagine just we have a multitude of servers, and what we don't want to do is overload one. So this particular area, this traffic cop, acts as a sort of a director, as it were. Okay. Now we'll see moving down the page that PAS and indeed SAS are certainly much more sort of premium-like than IAS, but nonetheless they're sort of built on each other. So PAS, in effect, IAS plus communication software. We see SAS, really PAS plus software applications hosted centrally. But the bottom line is, I guess, and it's more simplistic at the lower end, we're talking about a sort of a pay-as-you-go. The more you take, the more you pay in terms of this business model and this NCTech business model as it stands. Okay. Now, just a quick point about what we see up top here. We've talked a little bit about models. For me, when we think about what we've seen so far in this industry, particularly these stats here, this is an industry, both in Finland and indeed globally, that's very, very competitive. Now, we know from our studies, past studies of Porter's Five Forces, that Porter's Five Forces is all about the attractiveness or profitability of a given market or industry. Now, it seems to me, although NCTech are in the market, there's pretty high barriers to entry here. Look at the degree of competition. Only 10 companies, 85% of the market in the home country, and 74% globally. I mean, that's pretty heavy duty. So for me, in terms of the barriers, they're extremely high. What are they? Well, I would have thought finance, expertise, regulation, etc., infrastructure, and on and on. Now, the reason I've said be careful is, albeit for the fact that most of the models, if you spend a little bit of time with them, including Porter's Five Forces, are fairly easy to understand. This area here, certainly in relation to barriers, students tend to get confused on, even SBL students. So let's be careful. When we say this particular industry, has high barriers to entry, we're referring to the force new entrants. In other words, the threat of new entrants. So it sort of works in reverse, doesn't it? If we have high barriers to entry, then the threat of new entrants is low. What students tend to do is get those things mixed up. Just a minor point, but just be careful if that comes up. One other point about Porter's Five Forces, and remember, this is not uncommonly examined in the SBL exam. I've seen it several times over the last few years, is, we've got to make decisions in relation to a model like this. What I mean is, if we get a chance to wheel this out in a requirement, what the examiner is looking to do is to make a decision as to the strength of the force. What I've seen students do quite a lot with this particular model is sit on the fence. In other words, they're asked to apply Porter's Five Forces to assess whether or not a market or industry is attractive or profitable, but they don't say whether or not the force is strong, medium, or weak. You've got to take a punt. Will you get every single one right? Possibly not. It doesn't matter, but certainly make a decision. Okay. Outside of that, certainly we'll see within the strategic analysis video that there's pluses and minuses in Porter's Five Forces. In other words, there's some forces that are fairly strong, and there's some forces that aren't. So more of that in that video. Okay, so I'll just click the annotations off. Sorry that I have to keep doing this, but I think it's the best way for you to pick up as much information as possible. Let's move down now into our next section here. Okay, now much of this sort of, as you can see, sort of pertains to a rehash of what's up top. Yeah, and the key thing for me really on this particular page is really this area here, in terms of the delivery of the models. So let's recap here and let's not get confused. We've seen three models up top, three cloud service models. In essence, we might say the sort of basic IAS, NCTech, something in the middle, and indeed a high-end SaaS. Now, in terms of the delivery, that's slightly different. There are several options. And again, it sort of works in the same way. You'll be familiar with the public cloud. You may also be familiar, perhaps from your employer, with the private cloud. The hybrid just being a combination of both. Now, in essence, the way that we can split these apart from the terminology is really cost. In other words, the cost to the user. What we see here is, a reference to, within the public cloud, broadly speaking, any organization or any individual using things like Google Drive or YouTube, perhaps on a pay-as-you-use basis or even free. When we move into this area of private cloud, we're moving into the most expensive sort of delivery model, as it were. And we're talking about exclusive use, as you can imagine, given the name private, for specific business clients. Now, given the costs, this is suitable certainly to large businesses that have key requirements, complex computer processing requirement capability, okay? And as mentioned, we're talking about a premium price. Now, the hybrid area, as you would expect, is just a combo of both. And certainly there's a great degree of operational flexibility with it. And the bottom line here, or I guess the attractiveness, is the idea of the cost. In other words, cheaper than the private cloud, but certainly more expensive given the fact that it has an element of privacy to it. Now, I've highlighted generic strategies in terms of this model. I guess I could have done it slightly earlier on. Again, I'm trying to point out here and there some areas within the syllabus to get the juices flowing, to get us thinking about what is this company about. Now, when we think about generic strategies, let's remember that, if Michael Porter was sitting with us now and looking at NCTech and asking questions, the questions he's asking really are, how does a company like NCTech achieve competitive advantage? How do they do it? Now, what does competitive advantage mean? It basically means a competitive edge over rivals, over competitors. Now, simplifying Porter's generic strategies, we're really talking about three main areas. Now, I know you're probably familiar with this, but let me just remind you anyway. We're talking about either cost leadership, we're talking differentiation, or indeed focus stroke niche. Now, we can build it out further, but let's keep it simple for the purpose of this particular video. Now, when I think about the different sort of models up top, and when I think about the information that we've seen so far and the information to come in this particular pre-seen document, for me, I would suggest to you that certainly this particular company really have to be in the area of a differentiator, because albeit for the fact that IAS is a basic service, they're a company that certainly differentiates themselves from other players in the market. And I would suggest that many of the service providers have to do that in order to be able to survive. We're talking about probably a fairly expensive service, even at basic IAS. We're talking about uniqueness. We're talking about good marketing. We're talking about, three very, very savvy engineers who've built up a successful business in a very, very short space of time. So for me, the answer to the question, and I don't think that we would get a direct question on Porter's generic strategies, but that doesn't mean that we can't mention an answer, is that NCTech differentiate themselves as best they can from other players in a variety of different ways. And again, I'd refer you to the strategic analysis, where I'm going to pick out some strengths and indeed weaknesses and one or two other areas that really support what I've just said. Let's move down the page. Let me just turn off the annotations before I do that, so I can surprise you, as it were. I hope that everything's making sense so far. Now, we're going to move into the sort of benefits of cloud services. Now, many of these are fairly straightforward. Do we need to rote learn them? I'd say yeah. Because, we need to be in a position where we have our I'm an employee of this company head on to be able to make decisions on the day. Now, for me, given the fact that we all have some form of exposure to the cloud, we'll probably be fairly savvy with most of them. And I've just picked up in green, there's certainly the key areas. Now, if you think about it, there's a sort of a crossover here, isn't there? From our studies back in the day, we'd be familiar with that old question of, the benefits of outsourcing or not outsourcing. And you'll see that many of these, link into it, particularly the ones over the page when we talk about costs or the saving costs. But this one is particularly relevant, certainly scalable. And this is what makes this particular industry, I think, grow so quickly. Instant access like a database is just what we need. This is an interesting one here because, again, you'll see that I've flagged this elsewhere. This area of security is problematic for companies such as NCTech and indeed their clients. Now, let me just turn the annotations on and give you a feel for what I've said outside of this. Now, In terms of security, I'm talking about cyber issues, cyber threats, and all the rest of it. If you look back on the SBL exam questions over the course of time, you're going to see that this has to be in one of the sort of top 10 areas, the whole area of cyber threats, cyber attacks, security, and all the rest of it. So of these benefits, as I say, they're fairly straightforward, but let's make sure we watch for number 3. Over the page, we'll see reference to what I've just said earlier on. Cost is a key issue or driver here. And note that when we think about the difference between the 3 various models, IAS versus PAS versus IAS, the bottom line is that over the course of time, as I've mentioned at least one now, these costs, or indeed the costs per company, as it were, are going to come down. So, it's only going to get better in the future. But the bottom line with 6 and 7 here is avoiding the need, certainly, for IT specialists, and certainly avoiding the need for a lot of space to house your IT and indeed IS systems. Okay? Now, next area for us, let me just turn the annotations off just for one moment. Okay, now let me talk about challenges and developments. We'll see reference to this within the strategic analysis, certainly. In other words, opportunities and threats within the SWOT, and also some areas of the Porter's 5 forces. But I can tell you certainly from reviewing SBL exams over the course of time, that challenges and developments, in other words, stuff that's going to happen in the future, a bit like opportunities and threats, are very often the source of questions. So for me, a little bit like the benefits up top, this is a very important area for us. Make sure you understand exactly what these challenges are and what these developments are, and possibly try and think about possible exam questions or exam scenarios based around these challenges. Remember, at the end of the day, as I said from the off, you are being tested in a sort of a role play situation. What the examiner wants to do is see if you can think on your feet. He presents you with, I don't know, some nightmare scenario and wants you to write a letter or wants you to advise the board. Some element of passing case study exams for me is about common sense. And what helps with common sense is to have some of the key facts. So let me walk you through some of the key challenges. Let me just get this up. Bear with me one second. Now, I'll put the annotations on just here because I think it's going to help us. Now, as mentioned top right, okay, questions based on the SWOT or indeed this area, I think are very, very possible. So number one, as we said, as we saw up top, this industry has massive growth, doubling in size potentially in the next 5 years. It doesn't get a lot bigger than that. This is dynamic. This is an industry that a lot of players want to get into, but as I said, we're talking about fairly high barriers to entry. In terms of number 2, here, global competition. Now, what the examiner tells us, or indeed what the ACCA tells us, is don't question SPOT. Okay, do not look at the pre-scene and look for hints or tips. I agree with that, but the bottom line is that we've been provided with the pre-scene information for a reason, and we've got to let our minds wander and use our imagination. And if number 2 here, where they talk about global competition, industry becoming dominated by large, well, as well as IT companies, if that's not a prompt towards the area of takeover, i.e. either take over NCTech by another, or possibly NCTech acquiring another company, then I don't know what is. Okay, the bottom line is, let's think about these areas and let's put our mind in the position of someone who's going to be advising the board, for example, about strategic benefits and risks, for example, about suitability, acceptability, and feasibility of acquiring XYZ company, etc., etc. Okay, this one here is interesting. And indeed, from my travels as a sort of a digital nomad, I understand the vagaries of not having a high-speed and reliable internet connection. But for this particular business, interestingly enough, no internet, no business. And as I've said here, to some extent, if we think back to Ansoff's matrix, I would have thought that that certainly limits us to a point, okay? You know, the bottom line is this industry doesn't work without reliability and indeed speed. So let's look for hints within the unseen. If this area comes up, I'd link that in, I think, to Porter's Diamond. Let's just say that NCTech and the board are looking to expand and they have a couple of options in terms of different markets, perhaps different countries. You know, then I'd be looking to look at, you know, the infrastructure. I'd be looking at related and supporting industries. I'd be looking at skilled labor. I'd be looking at, you know, demand conditions in terms of the sophistication of the population. Is it a developed country, etc., etc., etc. So you can see how some of the models that we're familiar with in the SBL syllabus sort of weave into each other. We've just linked Ansof's in one sense with Porter's Diamond. Okay, point number 4 here, no surprise again, yeah, this reference to risk from hacking and indeed denial of service. Now, you know, a couple of points here that are important for us. I mean, obviously this is a big area, but, you know, one of the things that I've seen a reasonable amount in, not just in the SBL, but also in other case study exams for other professional bodies, is topical areas. Now, if there isn't something topical in the last 5 to 10 years, I don't know what it is. If hacking, denial of service, cyber attack, if that isn't topical, I don't know what is, okay? Now, let's make sure that we have a feel for key terminology in this area. You know, the types of cyber threat, you know, ransomware, hacking, you know, etc., etc. We also need to think about potential scenarios. You know, for me, very often, not always, but if I was to punt, you know, it may well be that we're put in a position where we're after the event, not before the event. In other words, something has happened, something's gone wrong. So if I was reviewing content in relation to the SBL syllabus, I'd particularly be focusing on recovery or disaster recovery, or what do we do now, or what didn't we do and what we got to change. The other area that I think is important here, and indeed this is important across the board within the SBL exam, is change and indeed change management. Let's make sure that we're up on, you know, the difficulties associated with change and indeed the main theories as well. Okay, next area just here is pretty straightforward. Again, I'll refer you to the strategic analysis for number 5. Certainly a range of regulatory requirements, even in real life. And you'll know that, you know, there's been a fair amount of information in the press, particularly over the last 2 to 3 years, in terms of the difficulty in regulating industries that grow and spread so rapidly. I mean, look what's happened in the last 10 years for NCTech. Look at the internet over the last 15 years, 20 years, or thereabouts. I think this is the final area here, number 6, I believe so. What we're talking about here is staff and HR. Again, I wouldn't put this on my top 5, 6, or 7 topics within the SBL exam, but certainly the area of HR, human capital, etc., is important. You know, my experience certainly prior to lecturing and the businesses that I came into contact with, successful businesses get good staff, they attract them, and they keep them, they retain them. You know, how do they retain them? Packages. You know, the package that is offered. So in this particular industry, the whole area is much more skewed because we've got tech moving so quickly. We've got a limit on skilled staff. So, you know, they're in short supply and they cost a lot of money. That's an issue. And indeed, that's mentioned in the strategic analysis. So there's the challenges, the developments. I've mentioned opportunities and threats in the strategic analysis several times now. So, you know, I would certainly say that this is one of the areas that's sort of top of my list to really get a feel for. And if I was to point towards exam questions, this would probably be point number 1 or point number 2 is where I would start. Okay. I guess the next area that's certainly important is innovation. Okay, and again, when we think about innovation, you know, an examiner's favorite. Now, there's quite a lot of bump here, a word of caution. Okay, certainly my experience of dealing with, my experience of dealing with students where you have a case study exam and innovation or tech is relevant, they do tend to go overboard here. Now, as I've said a couple of times, I know that I'm repeating myself. If you did no research, zero, outside of the Astranti offering, not least this particular 3-set video set, and indeed the industry analysis, and perhaps to some extent the strategic analysis, then I think you'd be absolutely fine. If it was me, I'd do a little bit of research, and certainly my research would probably focus on the areas here. Why? Well, I just like, if I was in an exam where I thought that tech had a good chance of coming up, I'd like to be familiar with the terminology, because I think that would relax me more in the exam. You know, if quantum computing comes up, I don't know too much about it. You know, if AI comes up or robotics, well, I don't know too much about it. I'd like to know a little bit about it, because I think that would settle me within an exam question. So as I've said here, yeah, a little bit of research, but limited. And do check out the industry analysis. Now, in terms of this area of innovation, we're talking about, okay, what's going to happen in the future? And what he's done here, the examiner, is quite interesting. I'll explain in a moment. So, in essence, what we're saying is, okay, these things could change this particular industry in the future. So what I've said here is CSFs. In other words, critical success factors. Now, you'll be familiar with CSFs in the main. We're talking about things that need to go right for us to achieve our corporate objectives, or for us perhaps to be successful. So really, you might think of these areas, or a handle on these areas, of things for the future. So let's walk through a few of them, and you'll notice what he does. So let's deal with business intelligence first. We're talking about really an aid, or using data, storing, processing for decision making. Now note what he says here. If offered on the cloud, would satisfy growing demands for clients with access to BI systems. And he does that across the board. So really what we're saying here is we've got an industry where these things are not actually in play now. BI is not in play. Either is quantum computing in play in this particular industry, but if they were, then certainly they'd be snapped up. So again, this leads me to the idea that there would be a chance of questions in this area, which brings these sorts of new tech developments into play in some way. You know, what are the strategic benefits of an investment in this area? What would it bring to the table for clients? Now, let's be careful here. What the examiner is not going to do is to try and test whether or not you're an expert in quantum computing or in BI, not at all. But I think what he will do is test your common sense. So based on the information within the SBL syllabus, he's looking for you to weave your knowledge of the pre-seen, some knowledge shown within the unseen on the day, with your common sense, with your skills, okay? Now, if anyone's sitting listening to the call saying, God, that's a lot of things, that's a lot of balls that I have to juggle to be able to pass this exam, I don't think so. I think the key point is this: if you practice, juggling those balls with questions, with mock exams, you're going to get better juggling those balls, and you'll see the more questions you do, certainly if you're getting them marked, which is definitely going to help. I'd encourage you to get questions and indeed exams marked. It's not a sales pitch. It's about having someone independent say, yeah, that makes sense, or yes, you're on track. Do remember in relation to case study mock exams that with case study mock exams, there is no one correct answer. There's hundreds of answers. Your answer is different to mine. We could both pass. There's a number of different answers to case study questions, and indeed, albeit for the fact that some questions are more heavily geared towards technical knowledge, in the main, with a modicum of knowledge and good common sense and good skills, i.e. communication, timekeeping, etc., you can get yourself up to that pass mark, which is only 50%, and that's 50% of perfection. So it can be 50% not so good, and you can still pass. So getting back to the plot here, maybe a little bit of research, but let's be familiar with what's in this area of innovation and indeed tech developments. If we move down the page here, You know, I've said be familiar with the terminology. Some must feature. I think that's a fair chance. Feature in great detail? I don't think so. Yeah, let's just be familiar with the terminology. I put a red flag here only because, you know, this is an area that's just so topical. Read the press, read online, you'll see there's an article about AI just about every other day. Absolutely. Okay, we're just moving into the next key area now. Now, this is interesting because it concerns KPIs. I'll leave the annotations up because there's not too many now. So what they're suggesting here is that there are a number of certainly operational and indeed financial KPIs that would be relevant to companies within this industry. And for me, the operational ones are fairly straightforward. Note that we don't get any numbers here, we just get detail. Now, certainly for me, I would, given that I've highlighted this in green, I would be familiar with this terminology. I would be familiar with each of the 4 operational KPIs, absolutely. Okay, just one key point before I come back to the financial KPIs. You know, I do think that reading around the area of breaches or cybersecurity, cyber threats, in other words, examples, yeah, I do think that's a good idea. In particular, reading about recovery. In other words, reading about what companies did after the event. Okay, you can get that from press releases, you can get that from websites. Certainly, this is an area that, you know, if I was to do a little bit of research outside of what's within pre-scene on the industry, this is one of the areas that would definitely be on my list. So in summary there on the KPIs, yeah, let's make sure that we can quote what these KPIs are, okay? Now, why have I put a red flag up here? Well, not so much because of what I've said so far, but because my experience of marking SBL mock exams where KPIs come into play is the performance of students is not good. In other words, where students are asked to come up with KPIs off their own back, they find it very difficult to do that. I don't know why. I don't know why. Bottom line is, it's an exam question. I'm not saying it comes up every sitting, but certainly more often than not, certainly more than 50% of the time, when I mark SBL scripts, mock exam scripts, certainly KPIs are not an area that's dealt with. Now, what does that tell us? It's highly likely that when they're examined on the day, i.e. in the real exam, it's highly likely that students are underperforming. What does that tell us? That tells us that this is a topic area that we need to revise. Let's look into what we mean by KPIs, and also in particular, I mentioned up top about CSF. Where do KPIs sit in the broader scheme of things? You know, we know that right at the top there, we've got corporate objectives, we've got goals, you know we've got mission, vision up there. You know, what's the hierarchy? Yeah, and indeed over and above that, you know, let's look for questions where we're required to come up with suitable KPIs based on information given, and let's see how we do. Let's fail in those questions, no problem at all. Yeah, and let's be ready for a question on the day. Okay. In terms of the financial area, very, very straightforward. I won't spend too much time on this because I think much of this, you know, you'll be familiar with from your other studies. When we think about financial KPIs like revenue per client, operating profit margin, or OCE, another reference, hey ho, to security breaches. So here, this is an area that I'm not overly concerned with. There's not really a big bias within the SBL exam towards the financial area as such, certainly not in my experience. So for me, a little bit sort of low level, okay? So in essence then, we've sort of been through all the way to background, which is here on NCTech. And really what we're going to be doing in video number 2 is I'm going to be walking you through all of the detail in relation to NTech, all the way up until the strategic information or strategic analysis area. Let me just remind you on the page here. So really, there we are. So what we've done in this first video is just gone from really sort of 1 to 5, as it were. And I've picked out areas that I think are important, areas that are less important. So bottom line is this, that what we should be doing is certainly rewatching this video. I would certainly be taking notes from video to video. So I think it's important to watch it once first, bite-sized chunks, make some notes on the second read. And I do the same with pre-scene video 2 and indeed with pre-scene video 3. I'd also do the same with the strategic analysis. Okay, so I hope that you found my run-through of pages 2 to 5 helpful, and indeed your introduction to NCTech. I hope that the exam technique points and indeed the prompts that I gave you towards the syllabus, I hope you'll take action on those, and I look forward to seeing you on pre-scene video 2 in due course. Thank you for listening to me.
So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you have found it useful. If you did enjoy this video and you want to see more of it, then please do visit our website www.astranti.com. We have a free ACCA SBL pre-scene pack that includes all 3 videos for the pre-scene analysis, the strategic analysis, and the top 10 pre-scene issues. In addition to that, we also have our industry analysis document and 2 ACCA SBL mock exams with complete solutions for you to practice ahead of the exam. And also, you have access to our SBL discussion board, so you and fellow students like yourself in the same position studying for this exam will be able to chat, will be able to ask questions and receive answers from our tutors. And the best part is all of this is completely free. In order to access this, please click the link in the description or visit the website www.astranti.com and sign up for our free ACCA SBL resources now. So thank you again for watching this video, and do check out that website for more free content.